Quilters always enjoy traditional patterns, but sometimes it's fun to step outside the box and try some new creative ideas. I'm Louise from Inspired Quilting by Louise, and I want to show you how to use your fabric scraps along with your leftover charm squares to make a stunning quilt. This is a quick and easy method, and it even eliminates matching seams. Do you know how much time that saves? This is a technique you will absolutely love. Come on, let me show you exactly how to make this quilt. My quilts always start with lots of fabrics, generally speaking. I love the scrappy look. I love mixing lots of different prints and batiks and low volume and such together, and I think it makes a beautiful look. What I have here are scrappy pieces from a multitude of quilts, and some of these are probably as much as a couple years old. And I have low volume fabric here that I'm going to use as my background, and some of the lighter ones will be accents. But primarily, I'm going to use squares. Now, these are charm squares, and these are various solids that I have. I have some batiks. And here's just a fun one. Look at that. It's got the pink and green, kind of the colors that I'm going for. That'll work out good. But I have lots of strips and even the little ones. It's just fun for me to sew lots of little pieces of fabric together, make it into something bigger, and then create a gorgeous quilt. So let me get started, and I'll be back and I'll show you some more. This quilt is a lot of fun, and what I've done is I've created two major components. The first thing will be the rows of charm squares. I had a lot of charm squares, and it just made sense to use them as they were. And so I pulled aside 140, which is about 3+ charm packs if you're going to be doing that. But what I did is everything here is scrappy. Everything came out of my pile. It's left over from something else. And I wanted to have 10 rows of charms that are each 14 wide, which is going to give me, 63 inches, which is a great size if I'm going to do a lap quilt, which is sort of my plan. Now, I divided my color groups in order to kind of create some balance and interest. So half of my 140 were pinks, and it may be pink, it may be red, it may be mauve, it may be graphic, it may be batik, it could be any one of a number of different prints, and I'm going to show you here some of my choices. So here's a nice clear pink, and this is more the mauve-y pink, and this is sort of a definite red with a bit of pink in there. So I went through and pulled all these different pinkish colors and put them in a pile. And I wanted half of my blocks in the charm squares to be in that pink family. Now, the other half I divided into low volume and my second accent color, which in this case is green. So you'll see I have pinks, I have greens, and I have low volume. Low volume for me is the white or creamy background. Now, even though this has a lot of pink, it's going to enhance and bring out more pink in the quilt, but the white background sort of lets things rest every once in a while. As you're going across, you're getting a break from all that color. And this is actually one of my greens, but I used it because it has the pink in it. Same here. I want to carry that pink throughout the quilt. And here are some others. This is actually a low volume with a white background. This is a green. And even though these flowers are a bit more on the coral side, it still works with all the pinks and the variants of that color throughout. A few bold pieces, we've got to have some good graphics. We've got some dots and stripes. And, some traditional calicos, some batiks, some graphics, just a lot of really fun and interesting fabrics. So whatever you have, take advantage of it and use it in a way that really works well together and looks terrific, something that you like. So you'll also see that my greens are showing up in some different ways. Here, let's go this way. And this is more of a dull green, where this is a batik, a really light green. I have a lot of green in the florals. So that color is being carried through, sometimes more bold and other times more subtle. And here's a batik with some green. So I'm bringing the green in, but not in a splash in your face kind of way. It'll be there and you'll see it and it'll stand out as an accent, but it's not going to be dominant throughout the quilt. And so these are just some of the pieces that I used, and I'm really excited about how it turned out. So this is my set of, let's see, 10 rows of 14 charm squares. And like I said, everything is chain pieced together. But I don't want to just sew rows and rows and have to match up these seams. If I can come in and put something in between here, let's say I have these two side by side, and I can put a row of something like this in between, it's going to change up where my seams fall, and I'm not going to have all those matching seams. So let me show you now what I'm using in between my charm squares. I think you'll love it. I know I sure do. As you're sorting through your charm squares for these first rows that we're assembling, you'll probably come across pieces that may be, not quite 5 inches in one direction or both. Make sure you hang on to these, because if they're the color that you want to use in the quilt, we're going to find a way to put them in, and I'll show you that here in a few minutes. But first, I want to show you what the alternating row is going to look like. You remember in the first pile of fabric that I showed you, I had lots and lots of strips. And that's from when I cut my fat quarters. If you've ever seen me cut fat quarters, I always end up with a 3 or 4 inch strip by the length of the fat quarter. And I just put those aside and I use them for various strip piecing that I do. And in this case, it worked out beautifully. So here's what I did. I take my strips and I group them by color, not unlike we did with the charm squares. So I have pinks and I have greens and I have low volume. And what I do is I put my low volumes together and I group them, whether they're green, whether they're pink, whether they're mostly, say, a creamy color, like something of this nature. And I put them in piles by the same size. So everything that's this size, regardless of the color, goes in this pile, and these the same. And then I have some 2.5, but I have 3 and 4. I don't have anything more than a charm square. I want everything in here to be smaller than a charm square. So with that being said, I have my strips together and I divide them into groups. And by doing this, I can place my strip sets in groups that I can join together. And then with that, I'm going to start sewing these into small subsets. And this is where I'm going to create that secondary row. So let's say I take this one here, and I'm going to sew it to that strip. And then what I can do is bring this one in, and I can sew, let's say, one of these pieces right here. So I would use this as one strip set, but I don't want this same 3 fabrics showing up repeatedly throughout the quilt. Would it really be that noticeable? Probably not. But for me, what I do is, once I decide what size my row is going to be, I'll either cut enough to do a pair or 3 of the same. So I cut this at 7 inches because I'm going with 3.5 inches for my center row between the charm squares. And that means I won't have more than 2 of this exact same pair side by side. For me, with a scrappy quilt, I don't want things falling side by side. And this is just a way that I can sort of preset this so that when I'm sewing, I'm very randomly organized. I don't have to sit and look at each block. I can just say, I know this isn't going to repeat itself, and that works for me. And that's just one of the steps that I take. Obviously, you're going to find ways that work for you. And that's what I'm just showing you are different methods to think about as you're going along. So I cut them into 7-inch pieces, and I'll go ahead and I'll sew. So I'll sew these two together, and I'll sew these two together, or these three together. There's no limit. I mean, I probably had a couple that had 4, but most of them were 3 or 2 widths side by side. And then what I would do is take this, that is my 7-inch piece, and I had a bunch of these, and I just cut it in half. So I have 2 3.5-inch pieces, because 3.5 is the size of the strip that's going to go between my charm square rows. And since all these are going to be different sizes, I'm not going to have any matching seams. Oh my goodness, that is such a time saver. You just boom, boom, boom. Everything gets pressed to one direction, so all the seams are going in the direction that you're sewing. Then when you go to put your 2 rows together, it's just sewing straight through, and it goes very, very quickly. Now, what I did with this is I created a bunch of low volume with some pinks and greens, mostly on the lighter colors. And when I cut these in half, I put one in this pile and one in the other, because again, I don't want these to all be side by side. So when I'm quilting, I will use this pile first, and then I'll put this on the bottom. And when I'm sewing my rows together, I'll just start going from the top and adding it all the way through. Now, every once in a while, though, I want to add some extra color. Where I had the low volumes, I added some narrow strips. I had narrow strips, 2.5-inch strips, left over from some quilting projects that I did. And actually, it's my Valentine's Day log cabin, and I'll be showing you that here in the near future. But by doing this, I'm going to add my pink throughout that row, but I'm putting low volume on each side of the pink. This way, when I put these together, I'm breaking up the colors. I don't want all the colors to fall together. So with the pinks, low volume on each side, these are mostly all low volume anyways. Oops, there's a little selvage right there. I'm going to have to set that one aside. But this is just a way to pre-plan. So I love this part of quilting. I love putting the colors together. I love planning how it's going to go together. By the time I get to the sewing machine, all I'm doing is sewing. There's no thinking about it. And for me, that just works really well. So I probably put a lot more thought into a lot of this than you may want to, and that's fine. You can do all this as you're sewing, or if you're going totally scrappy, just grab things out of your basket or your bin and just sew them through. Either way, you're going to come out with a great quilt that's a lot of fun. So what I'm doing here is I sew these, and I use all the strips that I had to make these blocks. Now, you get to a point where you sort of run out of one thing or another. And I had some extra low volume fabric. This is a real pretty one. It's an art gallery fabric with a really nice print. And it has that nice creamy background with a bit of a tan print on it. And this one, much the same, also art gallery. And this one has a graphic, what do I want to say? It's more of a geometric with the lines drawn in there. So I will take the end of the strips that I had left over from making all these pairs, and I'll cut them into 3.5 inches because that's the size of my row. And I'm just going to sew them all to a low volume background. And then I'm just going to cut these, and I have these pairs that I can mix in with the other blocks. So this is another way to get my fabrics mixed up well. And then I have these, And same kind of thing. Like I said, pink is dominant in this quilt, and I want to include lots of it in different ways. Bright pinks, darker pinks, lavender pinks, sort of dark fuchsia pinks, and graphic lines and florals and just all kinds of different ways to show my pink color throughout the quilt, and it's just going to look wonderful. And then, of course, at the very end, you have extras of something. So these all measure 3.5 inches in at least one direction. So these are squarish size, which is great, but these are more like from the 2.5-inch strips. So I can use these as I'm sewing along and say, ooh, this would be real pretty right here next to that one. Or maybe I like it better here. Now, I probably wouldn't put these two together because they're a bit much to take together, but when you put a near solid, it looks wonderful. With everything pieced together, all my strips are sewn. I'm going to begin cutting them apart into the smaller strip sets that will then become the alternating row between the charm squares. Now, this is a pretty quick process. I'm not going to use the grid because these are not necessarily any particular even size. They're 3.5 inches this way, but this direction is varying according to what the scrap piece was. I'm not cutting those into anything specific because I like the random look when they're all different sizes. That really adds some nice color. Now you'll notice here that I leave a little space, so that gives me room to do my trimming. And you can see it doesn't take a lot, but I'll come back and trim that in. But I just want to make sure, and I trim at the top of the block. So I line let me put that in, I line my ruler right up here with this edge, so that's nice and straight, and then I'm going to cut across. And you'll see that not everything is perfectly even. And that's because they're scraps. And these were pieces that we're just laying aside. So I'm going to cut the first side. And again, by lining my ruler up at the edge where my seam is, I know that that's my straight. And that's where I'm measuring from. And then I'm going to come back and do the same in the other direction. So we'll put that there. And there we are. Now I'm just going to turn everything the other way and do the same thing. So I put my ruler right on top, but I want to make sure that this corner is within the measurement so that when I cut it, I'm not losing too much of my edge, because then it's going to be hard to cut or to sew a straight seam. Now, once these are all cut, they're trimmed nice and we're ready to go, we're going to start piecing the rows. And I want to show you next how that's going to go together. So I'll finish those here in a minute, and we'll tuck all this aside. You know, these little rulers are great for lots of reasons, but they also get all the scraps of fabric. I can push it over like a little broom of sorts. So now I'm going to go to my machine, and these for the most part are all pairs. And I will sew these together, and randomly throughout I am going to, let's see, that's it. I don't want, these are all the same, so those will be spread out. But let's say I take these together and then I come in with this. So these I haven't trimmed down to my 3.5 inches, which is why it looks a little bit longer. And I'm going to do this and sew pieces until each row is at least 63 inches. On the ends, I want to make sure there's a wide block. So when I go to trim my ends, I don't cut it if I have a narrow piece and I cut it and there's just this little tiny strip there. I want it to have more of the fabric. So here's where I am. I have these all trimmed down to size. And these are the last of them. I need to cut down to my 3.5. These are already trimmed and ready to go. And, you know, I may just decide I want a little more color in here and put in something like this. So it's a matter of personal preference, and it's just, I think it's going to be fun to put together. I'm anxious to see how it all works. So let me get a couple rows together, and I'll show you what it looks like. Here are a whole bunch of strip sets joined together. And what I want to show you is basically I would take pairs and put them together like this, and just making sure that I'm not duplicating the same fabrics. And like, for example, let's see, we've got this one. There was one I sort of did a double on. So you see there's one place where I chain stitched. Now on this one I was coming down and I chain stitched, and I decided I wanted to add some extra. So I just cut the thread here, and then I started a new chain stitch over here. So if you want to add extra as you're going along, that's certainly doable. And that made it kind of fun. So as I was, you know, working my way through, if I wanted to, you know, put some extra pieces together, I certainly could. So what I'm going to do now is cut all these apart and pair them up one more time. And then I'll start getting a feel for what some of these strips will look like. And at that point, I can put my long strips together. Now, all that was left out of all those pieces are these few. And what I'll do is when I put two together, say this one and this one, then I will choose one that will go right in between. So that's kind of how I plan on working this out. So I just wanted to show you at this point where I am. And then I'm now actually going to put real strips together and attach them to the charm square and show you what that looks like. I'm really excited to see that. And here's the final quilt layout. I love how it turned out. It's so pretty. All those pink and green charm squares splashed around with the narrow strips in between. You see how those narrow strips along between the charm squares really adds a lot of interest. It changes the look incredibly. And what I really like is that there's no matching seams. So everything can get pressed in one direction and just sew and get it finished. But I will admit I have one more row I need to add, actually a pair of rows, a charm and then the narrow strip. And so that will make this quilt be about 63 by 78, maybe almost 80 inches. So that's a great size quilt. Whether for lap or twin bed, I think it's wonderful. It turned out so pretty. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you following along. As always, it's such a pleasure to share my quilts with you. You have a fantastic rest of your day.